The wine hit the polished marble floor before the laughter even started. Isabella Laurent tilted the bottle with a deliberate cold elegance, crimson liquid splashing across the floor like a fresh wound. Her friends burst into a cruel, hollow amusement, their eyes fixed on the man standing before them. His name was Jae-hyun. To them he was just a ghost in a worn suit, a quiet cleaner who moved through the halls of her father's global empire like he didn't exist. Isabella leaned in, her eyes gleaming with a dangerous mischief. "Since you look so experienced," she teased, her voice dripping with a mockery that felt like a blade, "why don't you give me some financial advice?" The room went still, expecting a stutter or perhaps a bow of shame. Instead, Jae-hyun slowly set aside his mop. He looked at her, not with fear but with a surgical, terrifying precision. He spoke 5 words that made every heart at that table skip a beat. 5 words that would ignite a war and bring a corrupt dynasty to its knees. He said, "Your father is being liquidated." What Isabella didn't know was that the man she was mocking used to move the very foundations of the global market with a single keystroke. Jae-hyun was once a feared titan, a builder of empires, until the same predators now circling her father destroyed his life and hunted him into the shadows. For 3 years he had been a man of silence, a man of peace. But now the silence was over. He wasn't just a fallen boss, he was a man who had been waiting for the right moment to strike back. And it was going to be absolutely brutal. Welcome to a world where shadows have teeth. Before we descend into this battle for survival, hit that subscribe button and tell us, how far would you go for justice? Let me tell you about a man named Jae-hyun. At 40 years old, his entire universe had been compressed into the 4 walls of the Laurent corporate headquarters in a foreign land. To the executives who strode past him, he was invisible, a part of the furniture, a servant to their arrogance. Jae-hyun was good at being forgotten. He moved through the offices like a phantom, never drawing a glance, never making a sound. That was the plan. To disappear until the fire died down. But Jae-hyun wasn't always a man who carried a mop. No, his story was written in the blood and ink of the Seoul Stock Exchange. 3 years ago he had a different life. Back then he was the ghost of Seoul, the most brilliant and feared financial strategist in the East. He sat at the right hand of power, commanding billions, until a betrayal so deep and so violent forced him to abandon his name and flee for his life. He had traded a throne for a bucket and a legacy for a hiding spot. But as Isabella Laurent was about to find out, you can strip a lion of his pride, but you can never strip him of his claws. The mop moved in a rhythmic, soul-crushing arc, the gray water streaking across the marble like a map of a life he no longer owned. Every push was a penance, a deliberate slowing of a mind that used to process global market shifts in microseconds. In the sterile silence of the Laurent corporate lobby, Jae-hyun was a ghost haunting his own skin, dressed in a worn suit that served as a shroud for the titan he had once been. To the executives who stepped over his bucket, he was a fixture of the architecture, a man of no consequence. And that was the only reason he was still breathing. In Seoul, they called his downfall the Great Erasing. He hadn't just lost his company. He had been systematically deleted from the history of the Republic. One day he was the ghost of Seoul, a man whose whisper could devalue currency. The next he was a fugitive framed for a $900 million treason he didn't commit, his name turned into a curse by the very mentor who had taught him how to hunt. He had watched from a flickering television in a rainy alley as his legacy was torn apart by jackals in silk ties. He had fled with nothing but the clothes on his back and the cold, hard weight of a backup drive in his pocket, the only evidence that he wasn't the monster the world believed him to be. Now his reality was the smell of industrial ammonia and the sting of sweat in his eyes. He lived in a room that felt like a cage, counting centimes and tips like they were the last drops of water in a desert. He had traded a corner office for a utility closet, choosing the invisibility of a servant over the target on a CEO's back. He was a man waiting for the fire to go out, convinced that if he stayed small enough the shadows wouldn't find him. But as he looked down at the crimson wine stain he had just scrubbed away, he felt a familiar, dangerous heat rising in his chest. The waiting was no longer about safety. It was becoming a slow-burn fuse. He had tried to bury the lion, but the girl with the wine bottle had just reminded him that he still had teeth. The Laurent Tower loomed over the city like a monument to an unquenchable god, a $50 billion fortress of glass and cold ambition that seemed to breathe with the heartbeat of global trade. Inside, the air was thin, oxygenated for men who moved mountains with a signature, but for Isabella Laurent, it felt like a vacuum. She moved through the executive suite with a deliberate diamond-hard elegance, a choreographed display of power designed to mask the trembling in her marrow. Her father's latest play, a massive acquisition of a tech titan, was supposed to be his legacy, the final stone in a wall that would protect their bloodline forever. To the world, she was the untouchable heiress, but behind the designer silk and the sharp, mocking smiles, she was a child standing on a cracking frozen lake. The deal was a behemoth, a $50 billion monster that promised to consume its competitors, yet Isabella could see the shadows lengthening in her father's eyes. She used her beauty and her status like a shield, striking out at subordinates like the man with the mop to prove she still had a pulse, to prove that the Laurent name still carried the weight of a hammer. But the cleaner's words, those 5 surgical strikes of truth, had pierced through her armor like a high-velocity round. "Your father is being liquidated," wasn't just a threat. It was a mirror held up to the rot she had been sensing in the boardrooms for months. As she stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the rain wash over the city, Isabella realized her deliberate elegance was nothing more than a shroud for a dying empire. She was surrounded by $800 stakes and men who laughed at her jokes, yet she had never felt more impoverished. The deal was supposed to be their greatest victory, but the ghost in the worn suit had seen the truth. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were the bait. For the first time in her life, the girl who had everything felt the cold wind of reality, and she realized that the only person who could stop the collapse was the man she had just tried to drown in a glass of wine. The penthouse suite was a cathedral of silence, the air thick with the scent of expensive rain and the metallic tang of fear. Isabella sat at her mahogany desk, the small black drive Jae-hyun had handed her resting in her palm like a cold, unexploded grenade. Her father's analysts, men with Ivy League degrees and $1,000 haircuts, had spent months assuring them that the Vertex acquisition was a masterstroke, a crowning achievement for the Laurent name. But the cleaner's eyes hadn't lied. With a hand that trembled despite her best efforts to remain elegant, she slid the drive into her laptop. The screen didn't just flicker to life, it screamed. Data flooded the monitor in a rhythmic, violent pulse of crimson and obsidian. This wasn't the sanitized, polished PowerPoint presentations she was used to seeing in the boardroom. This was the anatomy of a slaughter. Jae-hyun's analysis didn't just look at the numbers. It saw the ghosts behind them. He had mapped out a web of shell companies, hidden debts, and predatory short positions that functioned like a noose tightening around her father's neck. Isabella watched, breathless, as the code dismantled the $50 billion deal with the surgical cruelty of a man who had built the very system being used to kill them. She saw the Project Trojan files, biometric locks and encrypted signatures that her father's experts hadn't even detected. It was a level of strategic genius that felt ancient and terrifying, a blueprint for a corporate execution that was already 60% complete. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the solar plexus. The man she had treated like a servant, the man she had mocked for his worn suit and his mop, was the only person on the planet who truly understood the war they were in. He wasn't just a fallen boss, he was a titan in exile watching the world burn from the shadows. As the final graph on the screen plummeted into a bottomless red abyss, Isabella understood that her world wasn't just ending, it had been judged. She closed the laptop, the silence of the room now feeling like a tomb, and realized she had to find him before the hunters did. The rain didn't just fall, it hammered against the roof of Isabella's black sedan like a barrage of small arms fire. She had traded the sterile, scentless air of Laurent Tower for the stench of wet asphalt and diesel exhaust in a neighborhood the city had forgotten. According to the employee records she had nearly burned her fingers to bypass. This was where the man with the mop spent his nights. She stepped out into the downpour, her designer heels sinking into the grit of a cracked sidewalk, feeling the cold soak into her bones. This wasn't a home, it was a bunker. The apartment complex was a skeletal remains of concrete and rusted rebar, a far cry from the deliberate elegance of her father's empire. She climbed the stairs, the flickering fluorescent lights overhead humming with a dying electric buzz. When she reached the door, she didn't knock with the entitlement of an heiress. She stood there, the weight of the black drive's revelations pressing against her chest like a physical blow. The door wasn't locked. It gave way with a low, mournful groan, revealing a space that was less a room and more a monk's cell. There were no luxuries here, no trophies of a feared empire builder. The walls were bare, save for a single low-wattage bulb that cast long, jagged shadows across a desk covered in handwritten ledgers and a laptop that looked like it had seen a dozen wars. Jae-hyun was sitting by the window, his back to her, watching the storm with a stillness that felt predatory. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. He knew the scent of her perfume and the sound of her fear. As Isabella stepped further into the dim light, she realized the worn suit he wore to work was just a camouflage, a skin he shed when the sun went down. On the table sat a half-disassembled encrypted phone and a map of the Seoul Stock Exchange marked with surgical precision. The man before her wasn't a victim of a fall. He was a soldier in the middle of a long, cold extraction. He was the ghost of Seoul, a man who had been hunted into this concrete grave. For the first time, Isabella understood that the quiet cleaner she had mocked was a man capable of saving her world, or burning it to the ground just to see the light. The air in the cramped room was stagnant, tasting of ozone and cheap coffee, a stark contrast to the filtered, expensive oxygen of the Laurent boardrooms. Jae-hyun didn't move, his silhouette a jagged tear against the rain-streaked window. "You shouldn't have come here, Isabella," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of 1,000 lost battles. The drive was a gift. A warning. It wasn't an invitation. Isabella stood her ground, the deliberate elegance she usually wore like armor feeling brittle and thin. "My father's experts say the deal is a masterstroke. They say we're winning." Jae-hyun finally turned, the single bulb casting half his face into a mask of obsidian. A ghost of a smile, cold and surgical, touched his lips. "Winning? You're measuring victory in square footage and stock buybacks while the ground is being liquefied beneath your feet. Your father isn't an empire builder anymore. He's a caretaker for a museum of dying ideas." He stepped toward her, his presence expanding until the tiny room felt like a cage. "You think wealth is a shield. You think your name is a fortress. But in the world I come from, names are just targets. You've spent your life mocking the small details, the broken men, the mop wielders. But it's the small details that kill you. A single keystroke. A hidden liability. A debt buried on page 300 that no one bothers to read." Isabella felt her worldview, the one built on high-status arrogance and the safety of a $50 billion wall, begin to shatter under his terrifying precision. "Then why tell me? Why help us?" "I'm not helping you," Jae-hyun replied, his eyes blazing with a warrior smile that chilled her to the bone. "I'm balancing the scales. Your father's enemies are the same jackals who burned my life to the ground. They think they've won because I'm wearing a cleaner's suit. They think I've forgotten how to hunt." He leaned in, his breath a cold draft against her skin. "Go home, Isabella. Realize that your deliberate elegance is just a shroud. The war has already started. You're just the last one to hear the gunfire." The neon lights of Seoul didn't glow. They bled into the rain, casting a jagged, electric smear across the windows of the HN Global Tower. Inside the 78th floor, the air was heavy with the scent of expensive scotch and the cold, metallic tang of a looming execution. Jae-hyun stood at the glass, the ghost of Seoul, at the height of his power, watching the city pulse like a living circuit board he had designed himself. He was the prodigy, the man whose surgical precision had built an empire from the digital dirt of the stock exchange. Behind him sat his mentor, a man who had been like a father, pouring 2 glasses of amber liquid with a hand that didn't tremble, not even once. "You built a masterpiece, Jae-hyun," the older man whispered, his voice a low, dry rasp that carried the weight of a death sentence. Jae-hyun had found the hidden liabilities, the tiny rhythmic thefts buried in thousands of transactions that pointed directly to the board of directors. He had walked into that office expecting a thank you, expecting a father to help him fix the rot. Instead he found the source of it. In a heartbeat the world shifted on its axis. The mentor he trusted had already systematically deleted him, moving the stolen billions into accounts with Jae-hyun's signature and creating a mountain of lies that looked like treason. The betrayal wasn't just a loss of money, it was a great erasing of his soul. Within an hour the federal agents weren't hunting the thieves, they were hunting the ghost. Jae-hyun watched from the shadows of a rainy alley as his face was plastered across every news screen in the country, branded a criminal and a fugitive. He had fled into the dark with nothing but a black drive, and the clothes on his back, leaving behind a life that had been turned into a shroud. He had died that night in the rain of Seoul, reborn as a man of silence in a foreign land, waiting for the fire to go out. But as he stared at the rain in this new city, he realized the hunters hadn't just taken his company. They had left him with a warrior's smile, and a thirst for a reckoning that would be absolutely brutal. The curiosity was a fever, a high-velocity itch that Isabella couldn't stop scratching. She sat in the blue light of her private terminal, her fingers dancing across the keys with a frantic amateur energy that Jae-hyun would have called reckless. She wasn't just looking for a man, she was hunting a legend, digging through the great erasing of the Seoul Stock Exchange to find the truth behind the ghost. She bypassed the sanitized corporate registries, diving into the deep web archives of South Korean financial crimes, searching for the specific mountain of lies that had turned a titan into a cleaner. But the digital world has eyes that never sleep, and Isabella's deliberate elegance didn't translate to cybersecurity. Every time she pinged a server in Seoul, she left a digital footprint as loud as a gunshot in a canyon. She didn't realize that the shadowy forces who had destroyed Jae-hyun's life 3 years ago had left tripwires across the global net, waiting for the ghost to breathe. In a nondescript office building in the heart of Gangnam, a silent alarm triggered on a monitor belonging to a private security firm, the kind of men who don't carry briefcases but silence sidearms. The leak was instantaneous and absolute. A high-level data packet containing the geolocation of Isabella's terminal and the encrypted files she was accessing surged across the Pacific. The hunters who had spent 36 months convinced the ghost of Seoul was dead suddenly had a heartbeat to follow. They saw the connection to the Laurent Empire, and they realized their fallen boss wasn't just alive. He was infiltrating one of the largest companies in the world. Isabella stared at her screen, feeling a surge of triumph as a grainy old photo of a younger, sharper Jae-hyun flickered to life. She thought she was winning, that she was finally dismantling the mystery. She had no idea that her curiosity had just signed a death warrant. The quiet cleaner's sanctuary had been breached by the one person he was trying to save. As she leaned back, a satisfied smile on her face, 3,000 miles away, a team of professional liquidators was already boarding a private jet, their target locked on the foreign land where the ghost had been hunted into the light. The data didn't just crawl across the screen. It bled, a rhythmic pulse of digital treachery that Jae-hyun navigated with the surgical precision of a man who had seen this exact mountain of lies before. He sat in the flickering half-light of his skeletal apartment, the black drive humming as it dismantled the Laurent Empire's $50 billion masterpiece. Isabella's deliberate elegance had inadvertently opened a door he had spent 3 years trying to keep bolted, but now that the ghost of Seoul was awake, he was hunting the predator within her own house. Tracing the flow of hidden liabilities, Jae-hyun followed a trail of liquidations that led away from the board of directors and straight into the private, encrypted servers of the company's own risk management division. He saw the biometric locks and the shell company structure that functioned like a cancer, systematically hollowing out the Laurent's value from the inside. The liquidator wasn't a rival CEO or a foreign power. It was the person trusted to guard the gates, the head of risk management, Patricia Hayes. Jae-hyun watched the wire transfers dance across his monitor, each one a signature written in code that mirrored the betrayal that had forced him into exile. Patricia wasn't just burying red flags, she was Vincent's inside agent, the high-level saboteur who had been getting paid very well to ensure the $50 billion deal was a suicide pact. The Vertex acquisition was a Project Trojan, a hollow horse filled with fake patents and hidden debts designed to vaporize the Laurent legacy in 60 seconds. The realization was a cold, surgical verdict that made the tiny room feel like a war room. Jae-hyun understood that Isabella's father wasn't just walking off a cliff. He had been pushed by his most trusted general. As the final piece of evidence clicked into place, revealing the Luxembourg shell company that would trigger the bankruptcy, Jae-hyun felt the warrior's smile return to his face. He wasn't just a quiet cleaner anymore. He was the only man who knew that the liquidator was already inside the vault. He reached for his encrypted phone, the weight of the long game now shifting entirely onto his shoulders as the hunters from his past drew closer with every keystroke. The executive suite of Sterling Tower felt like a tomb of glass and cold ambition as Richard Laurent stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, his $50 billion empire pulsing beneath his feet. Behind him, Isabella stood with a hand that trembled, her deliberate elegance finally shattered by the Black Drive's revelations. Beside her stood the man in the worn suit, Jae-hyun, his surgical precision and warrior's smile cutting through the expensive, oxygenated air of the room. "You brought a janitor into my sanctum, Isabella?" Richard's voice was a low, dangerous rasp, a lion in winter refusing to acknowledge the noose tightening around his neck. He didn't look at Jae-hyun. He looked at the mop bucket left by the elevator as if it were an insult to his bloodline. "My CFO and the top auditing firms in the world have signed off on this deal. You're telling me a quiet cleaner has found a Project Trojan they all missed?" Jae-hyun stepped forward, his presence expanding until the enormous office felt like a cage. He didn't speak with the silence of a servant, but with the terrifying precision of the ghost of Seoul. "Your CFO didn't miss it, Mr. Laurent. He's the one who biometrically locked the door behind you." Jae-hyun tapped a key on the mahogany desk and the liquidator's trail, the Luxembourg Shell Company, and the hidden liabilities, erupted across the screens in a rhythmic pulse of digital treachery. "This is an identical fraud code from 2019, Jae-hyun said, his eyes blazing with the confidence of a general. "The same mountain of lies that was used to systematically delete my life is being used to liquidate yours." Richard's face went pale, the cruel smile he usually wore for subordinates vanishing as he saw his own signature written in code, on a bankruptcy filing dated for the following week. "It's a verdict, not a masterstroke," Jae-hyun continued, his voice a cold, surgical strike against Richard's arrogance. "You can believe your Ivy League experts and walk off a cliff, or you can realize that the man with the mop is the only one who can stop the gunfire already echoing in your boardrooms." The silence that followed was complete, a high-tension standoff between a fallen boss and a titan who realized he was no longer the hunter, but the bait. The elevator didn't chime. It hissed, a low, predatory exhale that signaled the end of the quiet cleaner's sanctuary. In the mirrored halls of the Laurent penthouse, the deliberate elegance of corporate strategy was suddenly shattered by the cold, heavy thud of combat boots on marble. Jae-hyun felt the shift in the air, the sudden thinning of oxygen that preceded a Project Trojan execution. He didn't look at the monitors anymore. He looked at the door, his warrior's smile turning into a mask of obsidian. The ghost of Seoul was no longer just a prodigy of the stock exchange. He was a man who had been hunted into a corner, and he knew the scent of the liquidators. Isabella stood frozen, the Black Drive still gripped in her hand like a cold grenade, as three men in tactical gear stepped into the room. They didn't carry briefcases. They carried silent sidearms and the terrifying precision of professional assassins. The leak Isabella had caused by recklessly pinging servers in Seoul had brought the shadowy forces of the Great Erasing directly to her father's doorstep. The transition from corporate drama to physical danger was instantaneous and brutal. As the lead hunter raised his weapon, his eyes fixed on the fallen boss, who had been systematically deleted 3 years ago. "You should have stayed a ghost, Jae-hyun," the hunter rasped, his voice a dry, deathly sound that carried the weight of the Seoul Stock Exchange betrayal. Jae-hyun didn't flinch. He stepped in front of Isabella, his worn suit now looking like the camouflage of a soldier. The quiet cleaner vanished, and in his place stood a man capable of saving or destroying, his fingers already moving with a surgical precision that had nothing to do with a mop. As the first shot hissed through the air, shattering a billion-dollar glass partition, Isabella realized the war had already started, and the man she had mocked was the only life raft left in a sinking empire. The shadows now had teeth, and the reckoning was going to be absolutely beautiful and unforgivingly violent. The quiet cleaner vanished in a heartbeat, replaced by a man of terrifying precision, who moved with the lethal grace of a predator reclaiming his territory. As the liquidators advanced through the smoke of the shattered glass partition, Jae-hyun didn't reach for a weapon. He reached for the glowing terminal on the mahogany desk. His fingers flew across the keys with surgical precision, not to move billions of dollars this time, but to turn the massive building of glass and steel into a high-tech death trap. With a single keystroke, he overrode the building's security grid, the quiet click of the magnetic locks echoing like a hammer cocking on a shotgun. "Lock this floor," Jae-hyun commanded the system, his voice no longer a low, dry rasp, but the steady, strong bark of a general in the heat of battle. The heavy blast doors hissed shut, isolating the hunters in the data center as the lights abadeed into a tactical crimson. He wasn't just trapping them physically, he was liquidating their financial air supply in real time. On the wall of monitors, the identical fraud code from Seoul began to cannibalize the attackers' offshore accounts, vaporizing their insurance policies and proxy company assets in a rhythmic pulse of digital treachery. Isabella watched breathless as the man she had mocked for serving soup and counting nickels dismantled a professional hit squad using nothing but code and shadow. The precision of terror was absolute. The hunters were now the bait, caught in a short squeeze that was absolutely beautiful and unforgivingly violent. Jae-hyun looked at the trapped men through the security feed, a warrior's smile cutting through the darkness. He had stopped being the victim and the ghost. He was the ghost of Seoul once more, proving that intelligence cannot be hidden by circumstances, and that his integrity was now a weapon of war. "It's done," he whispered, the closing bell of the corporate security system ringing out like a cold, surgical verdict against his enemies. The boardroom was a tomb of high-grade mahogany and cold, filtered air, the atmosphere thick with the terrifying precision of a looming execution. At the head of the table sat the liquidators, the board members who had conspired with Patricia Hayes to walk the Laurent empire off a cliff. They held their billion-dollar pens like weapons, ready to sign the Project Trojan papers that would finalize the $50 billion slaughter. But the door didn't just open, it was reclaimed. Jae-hyun stepped into the light, no longer the quiet cleaner in a worn suit, but a titan restored to his surgical precision. Beside him, Isabella Laurent stood with a mask of obsidian, her deliberate elegance now a warrior's smile. The board members froze, their cruel amusement vanishing as Jae-hyun dropped a small black drive onto the table with a quiet click that sounded like a hammer cocking on a shotgun. "The joke is over," Jae-hyun's voice rang out, a steady, strong bark that commanded instant silence. On the massive wall of monitors, the identical fraud code from the Ghost of Seoul era began to cannibalize the board's private offshore accounts in real time. "You didn't just compete with me, you tried to systematically delete a man who knows exactly how your system works." With a single keystroke, he triggered a short squeeze that sent the Laurent's hidden liabilities screaming into the public market. "Your insurance policies are gone," he said, his eyes blazing with a cold, surgical verdict. "By the time the closing bell rings in 5 minutes, every asset connected to your names will be vaporized." The liquidators scrambled, their protests echoing as they watched their corrupt empire crashing down on the screens. They weren't the hunters anymore. They were cornered animals caught in a perfect trap. Jae-hyun watched them with no emotion. A survivor, who understood that integrity is worth more than any amount of money. "It's done," he whispered as the market launched like a rocket, liquidating his enemies into a permanent digital grave. The war was finally over, and the ghost had delivered his final, beautiful judgment. The dust of the digital war had settled, leaving a silence in the boardroom more deafening than the gunfire that had preceded it. Richard Laurent stood among the wreckage of his desk, a man who had seen his empire survive a Project Trojan only because a quiet cleaner had held the line. He reached out a hand to Agent Jae-hyun, the ghost of Seoul, offering him the keys to a kingdom restored. "The job is yours, Jae-hyun," Richard said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp of respect. "Head of strategy. Build your own team. Name your price. We'll use the Laurent resources to reclaim your name in Korea and bury the men who framed you for good." Jae-hyun looked at the outstretched hand, then at the trading floor and the screens that had once been his only home. The mirrored halls and the designer suits were waiting for him, a chance to shed the worn suit and the mop forever. He could be the prodigy again, the sharpest mind on Wall Street, defined by the billions he moved with a single keystroke. The great erasing of his life could be undone, his reputation rebuilt from the ashes. But as he stared at his reflection in the dark glass, the ghost saw a man he no longer recognized. He wasn't the naive 26-year-old who trusted mentors, nor was he the victim who ran into the shadows. 3 years of counting nickels and dimes, and serving the city, had carved a different kind of integrity into his soul. He had learned that the small details matter most, and that shame and fear could never truly bury talent. "I'm not that man anymore, Richard," Jae-hyun finally said, his voice steady and strong, carrying the weight of a warrior who had survived. He realized he had been waiting for a return to a life that was just a role he was forced to play. The fallen boss was dead, and the ghost had found something more valuable than a corner office. He had found the ability to finally breathe. He turned away from the billions survivor who knew that the war was finally over, but the battlefield of his old life was no longer where he belonged. He chose the integrity of the man who walked away, leaving the empire behind to find a new name that wasn't written in code. The rain had slowed to a rhythmic, mournful tap against the glass of the Laurent rooftop, the city below a blanket of stars that Han Jae-hyun finally understood. He stood at the edge of the world he had just saved, holding a paper cup of black coffee, a habit from his days as a ghost that he refused to surrender for champagne. The elevator dinged, and Isabella Laurent stepped out into the night, her deliberate elegance replaced by the calm face of someone who had seen the fire and survived the war. She didn't approach him as an heiress. She approached him as a witness to a terrifying precision that could have burned the world down. "You're not taking the job," she said, her voice a whisper that carried the weight of their intellectual sparring. Jae-hyun turned to her, the shadows no longer having teeth in his eyes, but a real, genuine smile instead. He was no longer the fallen boss or the quiet cleaner. He was a man who had learned that the small details matter most, and that he could finally breathe. He looked at his reflection in the dark glass and realized he was neither the prodigy nor the victim anymore. Isabella stood beside him, just a partner, not a boss, feeling the unsettling pull of a man who chose integrity over any amount of money. She realized the man she had mocked was simply waiting for a victory that actually mattered. "I'm the woman who survived," she whispered, mirroring his strength, realizing her deliberate elegance had been forged into a warrior's smile. Jae-hyun took a slow sip of coffee and looked out at the foreign land that was now his home. "The next time you want my financial advice, Isabella," he said with a warrior's edge, "it's going to cost you more than a steak dinner." She laughed, a sound that finally healed something that had been broken, and reached out her hand. Their powerful partnership began not with a contract, but with the integrity of two survivors standing beyond the shadow, ready to build a new name from the ashes.